to start with just some information about sexual violence, things that we know from research. First of all, about 10% of adult victims of sexual violence are men, 90% are women. 20% of juvenile victims of sexual violence are men, so it's more common that boys are abused than adult men. As I'm sure you're aware, one of the places where men are more likely to be victims of sexual violence is in prison. Also very common that women in prison are survivors of sexual violence. 60% of that is perpetrated by prison staff. The image we're often given is of prisoners hurting each other, but prison staff are more likely the perpetrators. 98% of perpetrators of sexual violence are men. That means the vast majority of perpetrators are men. So the majority of rape by a large amount is men raping women, where men are the victims of rape, which is definitely a thing that happens. The vast majority of the time it's men that are also the perpetrators. It is a lot rarer that you have female perpetrators of male victims. Domestic violence is quite different. 50% of domestic violence is reciprocal, meaning both people involved did violence against each other. In the non-reciprocal situations where only one person is engaged in the domestic violence, 70% of the perpetrators are women. However, men are significantly more likely to inflict injury that requires medical care in reciprocal situations. And in reciprocal situations, it's 4 times more likely that there's injury. These are obviously kind of very binary statistics. We know that trans people are at significantly higher risk of sexual violence, but the surveys aren't large enough to capture the same level of accuracy for them, just because of the size of the population. So the overall point there is, the top line is the majority of the time we're talking about men doing sexual violence against women. Domestic violence, a lot more balanced, I guess. But there's obviously more to it than that, and anyone can be someone who is the victim of sexual violence. So we know some things about perpetrators by studying perpetrators. They do interviews with them in prison. This is obviously a somewhat selective sample. They've also done surveys of the population, but these things are hard to study. So any statistics about sexual violence, we should understand that there's limited ability to get exact precision there. But some of the things we've learned about perpetrators is that it seems that the vast majority of rape is committed by a fairly small number of serial rapists. So, what we find is that perpetrators tend to do it again and again and again. We also know that anyone can be a target, and that there is a full range of targets, from, the young to the old to people of all different sizes and shapes and so forth. We also know that one of the most common types of sexual violence today is acquaintance rape. This used to be called date rape, but we now think that's not such an accurate term. It turns out what's going on in the majority of acquaintance rape is actually that it has been set up by the perpetrator. So one of the ways this works is they often operate within and are protected by institutions. We obviously saw a horrific example of this with Larry Nassar. We also see this in particularly male-only social circles, sports teams, fraternities, that sort of thing, where the perpetrators can rely on other men to support them. They often turn these other men into unwitting accomplices who help them set up and make their victims more vulnerable for them without realizing that they're doing it in order to support a rapist. And so in the case of acquaintance, what we often find is that actually the perpetrator had maybe they had their frat brother introduce them to a woman who was their target. Maybe they ask their brothers to help get her drunk at a party or something, so it's not like him who's providing the drinks, which would be suspicious, right? But instead he gets them to help him, and then he often shows up to be the one that like offers to help take her home or something. So they use these male social circles, these kind of you know bro code or like wingman kind of rules to help them get in a situation where they can do the violence they want to do. We also know that there's no single profile here. Perpetrators seem to be evenly distributed across race, for example, and other demographics. Another thing that we know about perpetrators that's perhaps surprising is that very often they have access to consensual sex. Many of them are, in relationships that they are having consensual sex in, and they may be very, charming or successful or charismatic, right? They're not easily identifiable. And so, when they are intending to do violence, that's what they're doing on purpose. It's not the result of not being able to get consensual sex or not being able to get laid. It's that they want to do violence and they're setting up the situations for that. Again, this is based on, interviews with serial rapists that have been caught and imprisoned and then interviewed. We also know that there is a real cycle of abuse here, that it is very often the case that perpetrators are themselves survivors of childhood abuse. We also know that they have a pattern of escalating behavior, so they often start off with, sexual harassment, with touching and so forth, grabbing women, and then what they find is a lack of consequences, that they get away with it, and so they escalate until they get to the point where they're engaging in rape repeatedly. We also find, perhaps by definition, unsurprisingly, a lack of empathy and inability to understand how this hurts their victims, or a denial of how their victims would feel about it. Obviously a hostility towards women, but this often shows up in perpetrators in other aspects, right? We often see very strong patriarchal gender roles, slut shaming, talking about women very negatively, using abusive language towards women, and so forth, right? All these things are dehumanizing, which is an essential part of violence. We also find hypermasculinity, men who value their masculinity very highly, engage in like traditionally masculine pursuits and feel strongly about that. Another thing that shows up is alcohol use, and I'm not talking here about the use of alcohol as a rape drug, which is also common, but actually that it's common that the perpetrators are abusers of alcohol. And then finally, we find that they often believe a lot of the rape myths that we will talk about in a moment in a later